Good afternoon and welcome again to our Friday afternoon security seminar series. We have a special treat for you this afternoon. I know I've said that for several afternoons this semester. Each week we try to present an interesting speaker, someone who's had a big impact on the field and who has interesting things to say. Our speaker this afternoon definitely fits in that category. From the time when I was actually back as a freshman in college and started reading in information security and computer crime issues because of my interest, one name came up and continued to come up. Someone who's been a true pioneer in the field of information security, computer crime research, and simply issues of computing ethics. Don Parker is someone who should not need an introduction to many of you for his work in the field, but I'll say a few words about him. Don started his computing career back in 1952, and I suspect that is well before most of you were born. And he's been working in computers and making a large impact ever since. In 1967-68 time period, he was managing computer systems and got interested in some computer crime and ethics issues and discovered that others had not really been working in this area, so he took it on as his own. In 1969, he joined SRI Consulting and maintained a long and productive career there. He's been a speaker at conferences, at seminars, classes, and major events throughout the world in the years since then. He's written several books of great importance on computer crime and computer ethics. I've taught from several of them. They're wonderful. I have them in my collection, and if you're interested, I'd be happy to show them to you. And without taking any more of his time, let me tell you what an incredible pleasure it is to welcome Don Parker to Purdue University. So Don, thank you.
Thank you, Spaff. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I also am thankful that Spaff did not introduce me the way some others have introduced me. One guy, for instance, got up and just said, "Here he is, the bald eagle of computer crime," and sat down. So I'm thankful for kind words. I'm contrarian in this field. I think differently. I view information security differently than most people do, I think. One reason for that is that I've spent a lot of my past 30 years in security in interviewing computer criminals and their victims. And I think it's very important that those of us who work in information security know who the enemy is and get an opportunity to study that enemy, especially firsthand, and also the victims of this enemy that we face. I view ourselves very much as an army that's protecting information owners, organizations, and there's an enemy adversary out there trying to do harm to that information, and we're standing in the front line defending ourselves, in a sense playing a game with the enemy that is a real-life game. In my contrarian position, some called me a curmudgeon rather than that, but I like contrarian. I have a very great concern for information security that is not advanced. The concepts, the framework, the foundation has not advanced for the past 30 years. When we first conceived of what this is all about and what our goals should be. So therefore, we need to advance beyond these early concepts that we have not done. And so my presentation is to show you where I think that we are and have been, and where we need to go to advance our art. So if we look at the past 30 years, I claim that information security is an incomplete incorrect, inarticulate, incoherent, and if I had some more in words, I could add them to the list. I'm not very happy with the state of affairs. It is as though we are at the stage of alchemy, where the only elements we knew were fire, water, air, and earth. And that's pretty rudimentary when you think of physics and chemistry today, where we have a periodic table of elements that goes a little bit beyond those 4 words. So it is important that I think important that we have a new structure, that we be more correct, more accurate, more complete in our presentation of what information security is. And this is particularly important because with distributed computing that we have today, our job is to provide advice and assist information owners, business department managers, and so on, all out there. And we can't reach all of them personally and go out and hold their hands. And therefore, we have to tell them what to do and give them advice. And they speak different languages. They do not understand information security. In fact, they and everybody who is watching this presentation, I'm sure, hates security. I know I do. I hate the constraints of security on my work. I hate locks. I hate having to learn passwords. It is an unpleasant subject and constraint on us. And people will find every way they can to avoid having to take safeguard actions to protect their assets. And therefore, we have a job to sell, to convince people, and to give them a coherent reason and concept of what they need to do to protect themselves. So here is the current foundation and framework model as I see it and as I have seen, and I think you can also see this same model implicit in many of the writings, the papers and books that have been published. And it consists of what I call the CIA dumb model. And that model very simply has to do with the idea that we are preserving the security of information. That means we are preserving the confidentiality, the integrity, and availability, CIA. And unfortunately, the U.S. Department of Defense and the ISO International Standards Organization felt compelled to mess it up even further by adding the non-repudiation and the authenticity of people. Well, we're talking about information in this particular list, not of people. And that has further caused serious problems in the consistency and completeness of our model. Okay, we are to preserve all of these things, according to our model, from unintended destruction, disclosure, use, and modification, DDUM. And I suggest that if you examine this carefully and thought about it, you could easily come up with many more ways in which harm is done to, with, or by information. And yet, here we are stuck with this limited view. And the people we're trying to serve to help them protect their information don't understand these things. They just accept what we say and say, well, they're the experts, they must know. And we are deceiving these people into the idea that it is a very simple list such as this, and that's not true. We are to do this according to all the advice that we get through risk assessment. Risk assessment causes me a significant problem as well, and I've been trying to eliminate this practice of risk assessment, and I will talk some more about that. And there are 4 functions of security, or 4 types of controls according to our model: prevention, detection, recovery, and the awareness that we require, and that is a little bit newer addition to the model. But we're supposed to use these as controls, these different kinds of controls, to achieve the reduction of risk. And that is our overall goal in information security, the risk of loss. Unfortunately, there are also very serious problems with that, since I claim that risk is not generally measurable, and therefore we have a very difficult time if we're going to have a goal that we cannot measure. And so it is very important that we do something about this simplistic model. The things that we do today, that is, that we practice in large organizations, small organizations, government, business, and so forth, fall into these various categories. This is what I do anyway, have done every day of my working in this field for 30 years. We identify the threats against computers. We identify the system vulnerabilities. We engage in risk assessment, as I mentioned, trying to identify some means of making decisions about what controls, how much we should spend for protecting our information. And we design and implement safeguards. We create and promote policies, standards, guides, and procedures for our organizations. And we teach awareness. Nothing is said in here about motivation. You may remember in a few minutes ago I said people hate security. And so I find that teaching people, making them aware, and looking at the programs that we use, the teaching that we use for security, the major product, the major result of teaching awareness of security to people who hate it is simply to give them good guidance on how to avoid security. And so until you motivate people to want to be aware in a positive way to use security safeguards, you're going to have a negative effect on awareness. And so motivation is a critical point that often gets overlooked. I asked an instructor in a company about how they motivated people in their awareness program, and he said, "Oh, we have a really great motivator. You either do what we say in protecting your information, or you get fired." Well, that's not exactly what I had in mind in motivation. Motivation, as you know, involves carrots and sticks. And while we may have to penalize people for bad security, we should never be doing that without rewarding them for good security. And so overall, I think we need to have a more positive side, a positive approach to security if we're going to convince people to do something that they basically really don't like. There's a difference. A lot of the people in security, information security, come from information technology, from computer sciences. And they think of security in terms of analytical terms, because that's the way they're trained, that's the way they're taught. And they are dealing with computers primarily. And computers are predictable, they are repeatable, they will always do exactly the same thing under exactly the same circumstances. And people, on the other hand, whom we are dealing with in information security. I mean, we wouldn't be here if there weren't bad guys out there trying to do bad things to our clients. People are obviously very different than computers, but we have to recognize that even though we may be involved in intensely technical activities in protection within information systems and networks. Information security, we're dealing with a whole different array of issues that have to do with unpredictable people and with people who act in irrational ways. And I believe that if we try to, in trying to achieve an art, a state of a valid art, and maybe a science or an engineering or business discipline, we're always going to have trouble in advancing beyond an art state, I believe, because of the irrationalities of people. And by definition, you cannot put in an analytical, treat in an analytical way irrationality. And that's what we deal with when we're dealing with our enemies. Our enemies are not the rational or predictable or repeatable computers. They are the irrational, unpredictable people engaged in stressful activity of crime. And we have to remember that this makes information security a very, very different discipline, technology or a social science than technology, than information technology. So our adversary is human, not a computer. We hear this all the time, and I won't bore you anymore with that point. But there are no valid profiles of our enemies, and we do not have any valid statistics on our adversaries, and therefore, and we don't know who they are. We don't know who they will be in the future, the next ones. So we have quite a game that we're playing, as I mentioned earlier, with our adversaries. How would you like to play a card game or chess or whatever with your adversary, and you don't know the rules to the game, and your adversary says, well, don't worry, I'll tell you the rules as we go along, and your adversary cheats? And that's what our adversaries do. They cheat, they steal, they lie, they are deceptive because they're criminals. They're engaged in criminal activity, and that's what criminals are and do. They're not like us. Our norm is ethical behavior. Their norm is unethical behavior. So how'd you like to play this game? I don't think you'll win the first game, and you may not win the second one or maybe any of the games, but you might make some gains in playing the game a little longer each time before you lose. Well, that's a kind of a discouraging view of this whole thing, but there's a story here I always have to tell. I've told it many, many times all over the world, and it has to do with a young man who was inducted into the Army in a South American country. They didn't have their arms yet, so he was issued a broom, and he was taken out, and what do I do with this broom? For his training on the rifle range, they said, well, just aim it at the target and practice going bang, 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 and so he did that. They took him for bayonet practice. What do I do? Well, pretend there's a bayonet, practice stab, stab, stab. So he did that. Unfortunately, the war came along. The young man found himself out on the front lines with the enemy running at him across the field. He aimed the broom. He didn't know what else to do. He aimed the broom at the enemy, went bang, bang, bang. Some of the enemy soldiers fell down. Some of them got so close he had to go stab, stab, stab. So a few more fell down. There was one enemy soldier, there's always one in these stories, running at him across the field, bang, 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 no effect. The guy kept right at him, got so close he had to go stab, 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 no effect. In fact, the enemy soldier ran right over this guy, left him laying in the dirt, broke his broom in half. But as the enemy soldier ran by this guy, the guy laying in the dirt heard the enemy muttering under his breath, "Tank, tank, tank." So, like that story, we have to figure out what is the game that we're playing. And it is certainly not well represented by our current framework, our foundation and framework model. And I will show you that as we go along. Okay. Now, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are incomplete, they are incorrect, and yet you will find them. The ACM Communications had a series of articles on security recently, and there they were, CIA. You find them in the generally accepted system security principles that have been developed fairly recently. The British standard 7799, which is gaining popularity as a source of knowledge of information security controls and practices. You find it in COBIT in the audit world, also a baseline of controls. These three words. Confidentiality, well, we all know that has to do with the disclosure of information. But nothing is said about violating the confidentiality of information by observation of that information. It's all couched in the term disclosure. And so we have missed a very large part of what happens when confidentiality is violated. It is, in my estimation, most often violated by the enemy, by our adversaries, observing information, not disclosing information. And the victim is not overtly disclosing information to his or her adversaries, but is inadvertently allowing the information to be observed in some fashion. And confidentiality refers only to knowledge. Look it up in the dictionary and you will find that it refers to knowledge. Well, we have lots of information, and it's necessary to understand this. We have lots of information that is not knowledge. Knowledge is meant for human observation and use and memory, but there's lots of data that we have. For instance, object programs are not knowledge. Source programs are knowledge. Object programs are data, or as I say in my book, I refer to it as knowledge rather than knowledge. And confidentiality does not refer to information that is not knowledge. And so we are very incomplete in the way we use the word confidentiality. What about integrity? Again, we're in serious trouble. If you go read the definition of integrity, the definition that any of our clients, the information owners that we're trying to help, if they want to know what integrity is, they look in a dictionary as well. And you will find that integrity means that something is complete, is in good order, is the same as it was before. But there is nothing about the definition of integrity that has to do with whether it is valid and whether it is correct. Therefore, you can have information that is totally wrong, totally invalid, and has perfect integrity. It's all there. It just happens to be all wrong, but it's all there, and it's in good order. And it's the same at your PC as it was at the server. Therefore, integrity has been preserved from the server to your PC because it's all there and in good order. But it happens that it is all invalid, or it may include invalid information that's being used in some kind of a deception. So, we are using the word integrity wrong, and if we're going to deal with lots of people at arm's length, we're going to have to be sure that we're using words correctly. Availability, again, this is not quite so glaring, but it is there. Availability means that information is at hand, that is, it's usable. But the concept of availability does not include the concept of usefulness. How useful is this available information? And usefulness is an important element that we need to preserve for information. Now, if you get information in ciphered text form, encrypted, it is not useful for you yet in your application until it is decrypted. And therefore, we need to address the fact that usefulness is an important element that we need to protect. So where is the possession of information, the authenticity of information, and the utility of information? Those elements are totally missing from our very foundation. Going on, the next step in my little model here, we find, and we're dealing with the losses. Now, I have given you the 4 words: destruction, disclosure, use, and modification. And it is being said, and commonly said, that all bad things that can happen to or with information can be categorized in those 4 different kinds of losses that information may suffer. And this, again, is absolutely wrong, and it is incomplete. And I have given you here just my limited, my brief list of all the things that can go wrong. And I have an expanded list available to you that I claim is a complete list of everything that can happen that can cause a loss associated with information. And I always, in my lecturing, I always say this very definitely, because someday someone in some audience is going to come up with a loss I haven't thought of, and that is not in this list. And so I offer this to you as a challenge to see if you can embarrass me, if you can show me where at this level of abstraction that I'm using. You'll notice that I do not use crime words like fraud or theft in here. That at this level of abstraction, that this is a complete list. And as I say, this is just the abstract of the complete list, and you will find the complete list in the handout sheet that I have distributed. Okay, the next item in our model is that we must do risk assessment. And this has come from the very beginnings of our field. Bob Courtney, Bob Jacobson, and others working with NIST in the U.S. government developed the concept of risk assessment. And everybody says we must do risk assessment. Well, this is actually the subject of another talk of mine, but so I don't have the time to dwell on this now, but my point here is, and as I have, I believe, amply demonstrated in my book, that risk assessment does not work. It is an expensive failure. And I, at one time, finally convinced the Office of Management and Budget in the U.S. government of this, and they finally gave up in requiring the wasting of millions of dollars throughout our federal government by requiring that they do quantified risk assessment. We cannot predict the unknown acts against unknown targets by unknown irrational adversaries at unknown times and places. We simply cannot do that with enough insight to be of any use in the selection of controls and practices, which is the purpose of risk assessment. We do not know what the likelihood of a future attack or loss is going to be. Now, I admit that there are some special situations where some of this can be done, where you can see the high frequency of loss incidents and you apply controls and you see the loss incidents go down, then it goes back up again. Credit card fraud is one of the rare examples where this actually works. But generally, for business information, for most of the applications that we have to deal with, risk assessment is a total failure. We do not know how to put a security value on information. We can put a market value on it, we can put a product value on it, we can put a business value on it, but a security value on it we cannot do. And not only that, but for risk assessment, the likelihood that a loss is going to occur has to do with the value that our adversaries put on this information. And that further complicates because we don't know who the adversaries are to go ask them in a particular crime, what is the value of that information to them? And so it just does not work. And as I say, I have a complete demonstration of that in my book. And one last point about risk assessment. Business risk and business risk assessment is a well-known subject. We have a profession of risk management. And there are well-known techniques to engage in business risk assessment. But business risk and security risk are fundamentally different. And yet we have deceived management into believing, and they willing to accept, security risk as the same as business risk. Business risk is putting a fixed amount of capital or assets at risk to make a profit, a return on investment of getting your money back that you invested plus a profit. And so a business risk has to do with a positive approach to making money. And the most that you can normally lose, if you're not buying a margin, the amount you normally can lose is only the amount that you put at risk, that you have invested. Now consider security risk. Security risk is involuntary. Business risk is voluntarily putting this at risk. But security risk is involuntary. If you own information, you are involuntarily subject to the risk, and you cannot avoid it. And the amount that you gain is a reduction, hopefully, a reduction of loss. So it is a negative benefit that you receive. And you don't know how much. If you do a security risk assessment and you invest in a safeguard, and the losses that you have been sustaining, for instance, you install a firewall, and the number of intrusions and attempted intrusions go down, did the safeguard have anything to do with that? You don't know, because you don't know the adversaries. You can't go ask them. And therefore, there is not a direct coupling between trying to assess risk and then installing the controls that you might think should reduce that risk, because there are all unknown factors. I mean, the hackers may have to go back to school, and that's why all of a sudden the attacks on your system went away. Or they've decided that they're going to develop more powerful tools to overcome your firewall, so they've stopped and they're spending their time building tools. Or they've decided they have found some other vulnerability how to get you that is easier than where you put the firewall. Unknown modems that may be around in other people's offices. So risk assessment, forget it. Now, I've been trying to get rid of risk assessment for many years, and I have finally succeeded in several situations. There are very large international companies that have eliminated risk assessment and have replaced it with what I recommend, that is the practice of achieving standard of due care, a positive approach. I'll talk more about that. But otherwise, risk assessment keeps coming back like a bad penny. You try to get rid of it, and the next thing you know, you have some new technologists who have entered your area of work, and they're going to be analytical, and they create the whole mess of analytical approach to selection of safeguards all over again, and you've got to kill it again. Well, what I have really finally discovered is the problem is not killing risk assessment, it is killing the objective that I gave you in the current model of information security, and that is of risk reduction. And that is nonsense. We've got to replace our basic objective in security of risk reduction, which is not measurable, with the concept of meeting a standard of due care and best practices. And I will dwell on that as I go along. Okay, another thing I had listed in that model was the security functions that we use. And we've got prevention, we've got detection, we've got recovery, and mostly we use those three to describe, those are the functions, those are the kinds of controls we use. Recovery controls, we use prevention controls, we use detection controls. Everything fits in those three. And people fail to understand, again, that it is not that simple. We do a wider, or we should be doing, a much wider range of functions than that. Obvious one, the first one that you should always use is avoidance. Avoidance is a very important function in security, and that is the concept of getting rid of the security problem so you don't have to deal with it. It's so obvious that it just simply seems to be overlooked. You avoid a security problem by doing one of three things. You remove the threat from the asset, so the threat no longer has or could have any effect on the asset. You fire a computer operator who has been acting irrationally, or you remove the asset from the threat. And you take information that is where there's a possibility that you may suffer a loss if something bad happens to the information that you've got, and you get rid of it. So you have avoided a security problem, and that's the easiest way to solve a security problem in my mind. And the third way is that you can give the problem to somebody else. Now, someone else may be more effective or in a better position to deal with a security problem than you are. For instance, an insurance company. If you can't figure out how to protect this information, or if you think the safeguards you can think of are too expensive or too constraining on people to impose, okay, don't do it. Just go insure it. Well, it's not quite as simple as that, but the point is that you can avoid it in these three ways. Deterrence. If you think of information security as a human problem to deal with, a very important part of information security is to deter. And I think we have attacked, for example, the malicious hacker problem by technological means, and we generally fail at that. We have attacked it by the law and putting these people into prison, prosecuting them, and that probably has some good effect. Technology has some good effect as well. But there is another way to deal with this problem, and you wouldn't think of it unless you thought about deterrence. And that has to do with getting to these kids when they're 9, 10, or 11 years old and deterring them from going into the hacker culture to begin with. Because I've interviewed over 80 hackers just within the last 4 years. looking at this problem. And once they are in the hacker culture, they're captured in it. And it's addictive. And they're going to go through the process until they get burned, till they get old enough or discover they can be prosecuted as adults and get out of it. But if we can stop young people from going into the culture, we can dry it up, because it has to do with people passing a passage, a rite of passage. That wouldn't be thought of unless you thought about the value of deterrence. Well, I'm not going to go through all these others. I've talked about a couple of them: motivation, sanctions, and rewards. We need to correct our problems after we've recovered from them. You don't find that in these lists of security functions. So we've got to fix that up. And this is just a more graphic way of showing a timeline and the steps that a crime may go through, and the functions of security and how very limited they are at the present time, and how they must be expanded if we're going to deal with the whole problem. And I've also talked a little about motivation. How do we motivate people to protect their information when they hate that, having to do that so much? Well, you do that through a system of rewards and penalties. And the way to reward employees in organizations is that you give them more money. The way you penalize them, you withhold money. Or you give them better jobs, more responsibilities, or you give them poorer jobs, less responsibilities. Until we have built security into the employee-employer relationship, you can forget about having a valid, having a useful security program in an organization. It just simply is superficial, it is cosmetic, and it will never be anything more than superficial and cosmetic until we have connected security in some way with a system of rewards and penalties. So, in summary, what we have today starts with threats and vulnerabilities. It does not start with people threats and vulnerabilities. It ignores our adversaries. It often ignores our owners who hate security and need to be constrained and motivated at the same time. It is all inadequate and incorrect. And as I say, risk reduction, even our final objective in security, is wrong. Here's an example of what has happened as a result of this faulty folk art that we have. The U.S. Health Insurance Act. And it says, any organization shall ensure the integrity and confidentiality of information, protect against any threat to security and integrity, as though for some reason integrity is something different than security. They fail to understand, and I see senior people in our field who haven't figured that out yet, and they still talk about security and integrity. In fact, you can read that in the ACM communications 2 months ago. Of unauthorized uses and disclosures of information. They say nothing about observation of information. Well, authenticity, the availability, utility, possession of information, the observation of it, taking endangerment, failure to use, those are all missing from this law. And this is happening throughout our legislative process. We are giving our legislators the wrong advice. It is incorrect, incomplete, and it leads to nonsense like this. Okay, let me turn the coin over and suggest to you ways in which we can solve this problem, and I'm going to use much less time here in describing this because it is readily available, and hopefully I've motivated you sufficiently or gotten you mad enough so that you might go on and read more of what I propose to replace that. We need all 6 of these elements for security. We need to start with the owners. We need to consider a long list, a much longer list of kinds of losses that we must deal with. And as I say, this is my abbreviated list here. There is a longer list available. And we do this by application of all of these functions that I've identified here. And we do that through a process of meeting a standard of due care, of selecting these safeguards that we need using a standard of due care, and I'm going to describe what I mean by that. And our objective should be, first, the avoidance of negligence. And what I mean by that is we will continue to suffer losses no matter what we do. And our objective ought to be to make sure that when those losses occur, we are able to stand up and say, yes, we suffered a loss. However, we met a standard of due care, and you cannot fire me for negligence because I was doing the right thing, even though that loss did occur. And so there's a very personal value here of saving our jobs if we're going to be information security specialists, or if we're going to be as owners of information in a business or government setting. Then we're going to have to protect our rear ends, and we're going to have to make sure that we have met a standard of due care. That's what is important. Now, the reduction of risk, having less loss than we've had in the past, are serendipitous results of the work that we do and what we have learned over this past 30 years about what safeguards are appropriate and do they make life difficult for our adversaries. And we need to conform to laws, more and more laws, regulations, more of those. And conformance to laws and regulations, we need to meet the requirements of our insurance companies that are increasingly giving us lists and say, we will insure your information, all risk information, but in order to do so, you are going to have to prove that you are protecting that information. And so more and more we see the need for the British Standard 7799 as a source of what is the standard of due care, and COBIT in the audit world, and the criteria that we get from, common criteria we get from NIST. These all add up to what is the generally accepted standards of due care. And that is essential. This new model is essential, that is complete and correct and consistent and coherent. Well, I'm again saying that, challenging you. If you can do something better than I can, you're welcome to it. I've been retired for 2 years. I'm trying to get out of all this stuff and play with my grandchildren. But I can't leave it alone until you pick up the torch and carry it on. Here on, I'm going to go into a little more detail, and these slides you can see for yourselves. I go into the differences between these elements that I described to you. And I talk about authenticity and integrity are different. One I haven't discussed that I need to go back a little bit and talk about is the idea that confidentiality does not cover the possession of information. My point here is that it is possible to steal copies of information without violating the confidentiality of that information. And you can make copies of information, you can steal it, take it away, and you can use that information without ever knowing it, and therefore without ever violating its confidentiality. And therefore, if we are stuck only with confidentiality, then forgets the worries about software piracy, because that is an issue of possession, not of confidentiality. So, you can have confidential information that you can take, and you are violating a security element. You're violating the protection of the possession of that information. So these are two and very, very different. Now, in order to violate the confidentiality, you do need to possess it. But to possess it, you do not need to violate the confidentiality. So it works one way, it does not work the other way, and we need a separate, unique element to deal with the stealing with the taking of information. Okay, I'm going to go into just a few more items here very rapidly. Here are the definitions of these 6 elements, and these are based on the dictionary, and they should be the same whether it's in Chinese or German, Italian, or English. And it is important to have correct definitions of this of our elements. I have in the next 2 slides the complete list of accidental and intentional losses to or with information, and they're given in this slide and in the next one. And I'm not going to dwell on that, you're welcome to, as I say, think of anything I have forgotten. Now, in the damaging and destruction of information, again, I have 2 slides. I have a list of all of the possible ways in which damage, physical forces that can cause losses to or with information, in this slide and in the next one. And again, it's a challenge to you. Can you find and think of any possible way in which information could be physically damaged that has not been included in this list? And no one has thought of anything new for past 10 years or so. About 10 years ago, lecturing in Sydney, Australia, someone came up with living organisms. I did not have that one on my list, and I discovered that that's a very serious problem, especially when one evening Bank of America, the entire second shift of computer operations all got food poisoning simultaneously and shut down Bank of America in very harmful ways. So, if there's anybody can think of something, please let me know. And here's the second part of that list. And as I have distributed to you on a piece of paper, since it's too small to see on the slide, I've put all of these words, these descriptors, all into a matrix. And I've only cheated a little bit by adding another column on the right. I have listed here 27, I think there are, of whatever I call them, their control principles, essentially. They are the attributes of controls to differentiate the implementation of a control badly and the implementation of a control effectively. And there are 27 of these, and you can get an idea of what I mean. For instance, never install a control that until it is accepted by those who are constrained by it. Otherwise, they will beat you every time and make the control not work. That's just one of these, and you'll get an idea of the nature of all of them as you look at that list. baseline standard of due care is simply the concept that you need to install all the safeguards and practices in protection of information that other organizations, other prudent organizations would do under similar circumstances. So if you want to implement standard of due care in an organization, what you do is go look at the competitors of that organization, you go look at other organizations that have similar situations as you do, and make sure that you are using the same good controls and practices that they're using, or that you have documented a good and valid business reason for not implementing that control, or you have an alternative. But that is basically the concept of meeting a standard of due care. And I could go into that, but there are many ways in which you can determine from these lists that I told you about and from inquiring about how others protect themselves. And the baseline of due controls is expanding all the time. Permanent passwords is a standard of a baseline due control. But using tokens is not yet a due care control because it is not commonly accepted yet. However, it is moving in that direction, and ultimately the use of tokens or one-time passwords is going to fall into the standard of due care probably as we move along and get more experience with it. Okay. We need to go beyond this fire, water, earth, and air. We need to find this finer-grained, more complete model that avoids these omissions that I've talked about. Our advances have to be in keeping with the new concepts, the positive concepts of security. Security today is being thought of as an enabling function, particularly of electronic commerce. And so we need to have a positive objective, a positive goal of meeting a standard of due care, not a negative one of reducing risk. I talked about motivating people. We need to include security as a line item in our salary and performance reviews. It must become a part of the employee-employer relationship. And I call this the mother of all controls because nothing else will be anything more than cosmetic until we have done this. A little strong maybe, but I'm selling a point here. Finally, these are the things we really need to do. We need to replace our risk assessment with due care, put security into job performance, and strive for prudent security in business and not just the maximum that people will tolerate, because they'll turn off and we're doing damage rather than improving security. So we have to find the right level of security. And after all, business is seeking profits, productivity, and growth. And government is seeking to do service within a budget. Those are our objectives. And we have to recognize those objectives in the security recommendations that we make. And the military does not do that because their objective is security. And so therefore, we have to be very careful about what we do in emulating military approaches to information security. And that's gotten us into a lot of trouble. And it did with confidentiality, where that was their primary concern. And they totally missed the concept of possession. All right. Well, this gets us through the whole thing, and I would be happy to spend all the tremendous amount of time I have left if there are any questions. There may be one I can answer on the fly very quickly as I'm shoved off the platform. Yeah.
Are there any other motivators to consider other than the employee relationship?
Oh, well,
adopt security measures?
Sure, self-interest, and you know, the best time to recommend security to anybody is right after they have suffered a major loss.
Sure, I've experienced that. I'm thinking of times where there hasn't been an extant loss to say, you don't want to do that.
Well,
What is there a positive motivator that could be employed?
yeah, well, rewards is what you're talking about, not penalties. Motorola, for instance, has been holding semi-annual conferences within their company, and they offer television sets. They have the semi-annual award winner of who has done the most to advance security within their company, and they get a nice television set or a check for $500. They get their picture and an article about them in the company newsletter. Procter & Gamble does that. A number of large companies do find ways other than salary increase. And of course, salary increase and job advancement does not work unless it doesn't work if it's just on paper, obviously. It has to be the belief of your manager to motivate and say, I do it in my job, and my boss rewards me for security, and he rewards me for making you motivated to have security. So it's a top-down kind of thing. Any other questions or concerns? Yeah.
I'd like to go back to your statement on getting rid of the hacker environment. The original definition from what I've read, hackers are pretty much people who are going to basically find the flaws. I mean, it's been getting a lot of bad press lately. Whether they're actually going, you know, the definition of a hacker actually applies to them. Most of them are breaking the law. And according to the definition that I have found, that's not an actual definition of hacker.
Yeah.
Why would you want to get rid of some of that environment when some of them are actually helping other people?
Well, I hope that you noticed in my lecturing that whenever I use the word hacker to describe our enemies, our hacker enemies, I used the term malicious. Now, there are a couple of times thinking back I probably skipped over that word, but I make a practice whenever I'm talking about the culture of hackers that does us harm, that I always I try to refer to them as malicious hackers, because I feel quite proud that at one time I was a hacker. And I'm not saying that I did unethical things and got into other people's computers, but I pushed systems, I probed, I tried to do bad things to them just to see what happens, and that's what we should be doing in security, and that's what hackers have traditionally done. Malicious hackers simply do the things I just described without authorization, unintended things, and violating the law. So I'm glad you asked the question to clarify that point. Okay. Any other questions or challenges? Yes.
I told you I was going to ask you this earlier, but I will now. You've been doing this longer than most of the people in the room have been alive. And I'm just curious if beyond people repeatedly trying to do risk assessments, there are other things that are not good or bad that keep reoccurring that we have not learned from history that you could tell us about?
Those are the subjects of a lot of other lectures, but just to give you one little example, in studying computer criminals, and in particular my grandfather, who engaged in bank fraud and was convicted of bank fraud in 1912 and was caught, in fact, the same day the Titanic sank, engaged in bank fraud. The key thing in studying that case that I learned, and then and fairly recently, and then looked back and applied on 30 years of interviewing computer criminals, what I discovered is that one of the most important elements of the success of and failures of those crimes had to do with predictability. You had to predict the environment and circumstances of your crime if you're going to be successful in that crime. And if you cannot predict it, and if things happen that you're not prepared for, then you're going to fail or you're going to be caught. Well, if that is such a powerful force that works against our enemies, why don't we use that force on our side to make these systems more resistant? And this is an effort that comes about when you think about deterrence as well. And so my thesis is that to make systems more resistant to attack, there are ways in which we can make them unpredictable for unintended kinds of use, but predictable for intended kinds of use. And unpredictability is a very powerful force when you find this out, when you interact with criminals. Let's find ways to use that. And there are some very convenient, very simple ways it can be done, and unfortunately some very powerful but very complex ways it can be done. So I believe that we have hardly scratched the surface of using that as a powerful concept in security. That's just one of the things or an example of things that comes along through many years of doing this. And another thing that I was maybe too subtle in mentioning was the idea that our job is not to apply the maximum amount of security that we can possibly apply. In fact, for business purposes, our job is to provide the minimum amount of security consistent with the objectives of the business. And for example, if weak encryption is going to work just as well as strong encryption, and there is something to be gained otherwise in performance or cost or whatever, why use the more powerful safeguard when the weaker safeguard does just fine? Bill Murray, one of my peers in our field, goes around saying that we must use tokens, we must use one-time passwords, that permanent passwords are unacceptable. Well, and I say, well, not altogether, Bill. I think there are many, many applications where one-time passwords work just fine, and we should never change that and go right on using. Many other situations where the tougher level of security of one-time passwords becomes essential. And so it's not a black and white, it's not an all or nothing kind of world in the real world of security.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.